Today we're looking at Attila the Hun, the scourge of God.
Quite a reputation to live up to.
Yeah, there's some surprising sides to his character. Like some sources paint him as a, a real leader.
It's true. Attila is a very complex figure, much more than just the brutal warlord image.
Right, right. So even before we get to Attila himself, the Huns, they were a force to be reckoned with, causing chaos in the Roman world.
Oh, yeah. By Attila's time, they were dominant.
Wow.
Dominant force in Europe. Think about it. These nomadic warriors, incredible riders. I mean, their archery skills were unmatched, and their lifestyle, always on the move, dependent on their herds, and made them so adaptable. Really formidable opponents.
I've always been fascinated by the whole mystery of their language and where they came from. They left this huge mark, but we still don't know for sure about their language.
It's amazing, isn't it? A real historical puzzle.
Yeah.
Centuries of debate. Something, Turkic origins, maybe even linked to modern Chuvash. Others, they point to a mix of Central Asian influences. Could be Turkic, Mongolic, even Ugric. It just goes to show how much we still don't know about these guys.
Okay, so what about Attila's name itself? Does that give us any clues?
Well, there are a few theories floating around. The one that's popular with a lot of scholars is Germanic. It would mean, like, little father.
Little father.
Yeah. But then there's the Turkic origin, which translates to oceanic ruler.
Oceanic ruler.
Both are possible, which just adds to the mystery.
So picture Attila growing up in this world. The Huns, they were relatively new to Europe, but already causing so much disruption.
Oh, yeah, it was a wild time. The political scene was, well, incredibly complex. The Roman Empire, it was divided, struggling to hold on to power. And as the Huns expanded westward, the Germanic tribes, they were fleeing, desperately trying to find safety. Within the Roman borders, even, it was an era of immense change, a lot of uncertainty.
I see. So what about the relationship between the Romans and the Huns during this time? Was it just constant warfare, or was it more complicated?
Definitely more complicated. There were these shifting alliances. Sometimes they were enemies, sometimes not. The Romans, they actually used the Huns as mercenaries, sometimes even against other Romans.
And to other Romans, wow.
Yeah, and those internal conflicts. But the Romans knew that the Huns were dangerous. They were a threat. So there is this balance of power, very precarious.
Right, and then you've got Attila the warrior, the scourge of God.
Right, the image we all know.
Terrorizing everyone.
Yeah.
The Eastern and Western Roman empires. What were his campaigns like?
Brutal. Just brutal. A series of devastating attacks. He led them across the Danube twice, plundering the Balkans. Cities like Margis, Viminatium, they were sacked, the people massacred. He used all the latest technology. Battering rams, siege towers, just relentless. His ruthlessness was legendary.
I remember reading about the Battle of Nisus. It said the city was covered in bones. It's hard to imagine that kind of terror.
Yeah, the terror was very real. Attila forced Theodosius II, the Eastern Roman emperor, to accept these really harsh treaties, heavier tributes, solidifying his dominance. And then the Roman army was defeated at the Battle of the Eutus in 447. It just cemented his reputation as unstoppable.
But Attila, he wasn't content with just the East, was he?
No, his ambitions extended to the West. He set his sights on the Visigothic kingdom in Gaul.
Gaul, right, present-day France.
Yeah.
But the whole thing gets so complicated, the alliances. Attila's relationship with the Western Roman Empire, their general, Flavius Aetius. And then there's this whole story about his marriage proposal to Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III. It's a lot.
Well, Aetius, he had actually spent time with the Huns earlier in his career. He even used Hunnic troops to, improve his own position in the Roman Empire.
Wow. So he knew them well.
Right. So it adds this whole other layer to their conflict later on. And then you have Honoria. She sends Attila her engagement ring, asking for help. She was trying to escape a forced marriage.
So Attila sees this as a genuine proposal.
He did. And being the opportunist that he was, he demanded half of the Western Roman Empire as a dowry. I mean, talk about a bold move.
Valentinian wasn't just going to give up half his empire.
Of course not. He denied the whole thing, said it wasn't a legitimate proposal. He even exiled Honoria, trying to appease Attila.
But that just made Attila even angrier.
Exactly. It gave him a reason to launch his Western campaign. So in 451, he marches into Gaul with this massive army, Huns, various Germanic tribes, all under his command.
And that leads to the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. This huge clash, Romans, Visigoths, Franks, all against Attila, The stakes were so high.
Oh, absolutely. A monumental clash. The battle raged for hours. Heavy losses on both sides. The Visigothic-Roman alliance, they're generally considered the winners, but it wasn't decisive. Attila retreated, but his forces were mostly intact, still a threat.
So even after this setback, he wasn't done.
Oh no, he was relentless. In 452, he turned back to Italy, probably still furious about the whole Honorius situation and wanting revenge.
So this is when the Scourge of God really earned his name.
This is it. Attila's invasion of Italy was just devastating. City after city sacked. He left a trail of destruction. The city of Aquileia, it was razed to the ground so completely that people later on, they had trouble even finding where it was originally.
It's hard to imagine that kind of destruction.
It really is.
But here's what I don't get. Why didn't he attack Rome? He had all this power. He was so brutal. Why spare the heart of the empire?
That's the question, isn't it? Historians have been debating that one for centuries. There are a few possible explanations. His army might have been running low on supplies, or maybe there was famine, disease. Some accounts say there was this new Eastern Roman force approaching, putting pressure on him from another front.
So he was caught between two Roman forces.
Possibly. And then there are these accounts that suggest superstition.
Superstition.
Yeah, Alaric, the Visigothic leader, he died soon after he sacked Rome in 410. Maybe Attila was spooked by that, whatever the reason Rome was spared.
And then just a year later, Attila dies. 453. Under mysterious circumstances, what do we know about his death?
It's shrouded in mystery, for sure. The traditional story comes from the historian Priscus. He talks about Attila dying suddenly during a feast, celebrating his marriage to a young woman named Ildico. Maybe a nosebleed or internal bleeding. Maybe he drank too much. We don't know for sure.
I've also heard there's a more dramatic version.
Oh, yeah. A later account by Marcellinus comes. He suggests that Attila might have been assassinated by his new bride.
By his bride?
Yeah. It's a popular theory in fiction, but most historians don't buy it. They say it's just a rumor.
Okay, so no matter how he died, Attila's death marked the beginning of the end for the Hunnic Empire, right?
It did. And it's remarkable how quickly it fell apart. His sons, they were all greedy for power, fighting among themselves, which weakened their hold on the tribes.
Nice.
And then in 454, just a year after Attila dies, a group of Germanic tribes, led by this Gepid ruler, Ardaric, they revolted.
Wow, so soon after.
Yeah. And at the Battle of Nidau in Pannonia, they crushed the Huns. It was a decisive defeat. The empire was shattered. Attila's sons, they tried to regain control, but they failed. Within just a few years, the Hunnic Empire was gone. Just like that.
So an empire built on military might, it crumbled so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Almost poetic.
It really shows how important Attila's personality was, his leadership. He held this diverse group of warriors together. He was the glue. And once he was gone, well, everything fell apart.
So we've talked about Attila's rise, the brutality, the campaigns, the rapid collapse of his empire. But his story doesn't end there, does it?
Oh, absolutely. Attila's legacy is huge. He continues to fascinate people, historians, artists, everyone.
It's just so interesting to me how he's often portrayed as this one-dimensional figure of brutality. But some accounts show him differently.
Right. Some sources, especially from Germanic and Scandinavian traditions, they talk about him as this noble and wise ruler. He shows up in their epic poems, their sagas. They portray him with more nuance.
It's almost like there are two Attilas.
In a way, yeah. It reminds us that history is rarely black and white. Even figures like Attila, they can be complex. There can be contradictions.
Right. So his impact on European history, that's undeniable.
Oh, completely. His conquests, they changed everything. For example, Venice, it became a major power because people were fleeing Attila's invasions. They needed refuge. So they went to the islands in the Venetian lagoon. And his name, it's still used today. It means ruthlessness, power.
And there's that final mystery, his tomb.
It's true. Despite all the searching, all the theories, we still don't know where he's buried.
So it's like he disappeared.
It's like he vanished, took the secrets of his burial with him, all his wealth, all his power. Just imagine what could be in that lost tomb.
That's an incredible thought. The Scourge of God. This man who terrified empires, now he rests in an unknown grave, lost to history.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? It really makes you think, all these accounts, all this history, and we still don't know everything about him. Makes him even more, well, mysterious, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Like we've got pieces of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the Huns' nomadic lifestyle. It seemed like that was a big part of their success, militarily speaking.
Oh, absolutely. Their nomadic traditions gave them a huge edge. Think about it, they were constantly on the move. They could adapt to pretty much any environment, travel huge distances, live off the land.
So they could just like appear out of nowhere.
Exactly. Surprise attacks, harassing their enemies. They were masters of that kind of warfare. And of course, they were incredible horsemen. Their archery skills were, well, legendary.
And you said their diet was mainly meat and milk. Was that connected to their military success too?
It might sound strange, but yeah. A diet high in protein from meat and dairy would have given them the strength and stamina they needed, for their lifestyle, which was very different from the grain-based diets of, say, the Romans, more settled societies.
So their diet gave them an advantage.
Interesting. But they weren't just about brute force, right? They were also pretty clever strategically. Oh, without a doubt. Attila was a brilliant strategist. He understood the power of, well, psychological warfare, using fear and intimidation to weaken his enemies before a battle even started. And his campaigns, they were carefully planned. He'd exploit weaknesses, find cracks in alliances.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah.
His strategic thinking.
Sure. Take his attack on the Eastern Roman Empire in 441. He knew Theodosius II had sent troops to Sicily to fight the Vandals. This left the Balkans pretty open, undefended, and Attila seized the opportunity. He went deep into Roman territory, inflicted huge losses, and then demanded even bigger tributes. He was a master at timing and knowing when to strike.
It's like he was always one step ahead, like playing chess.
That's a great analogy. But let's not forget, he was also incredibly brutal.
Right, right.
His reign was marked by both military genius and, well, horrifying violence. He knew terror could be a weapon, just like a sword or a bow. Cities like Nisus, they were sacked, the inhabitants slaughtered. It was a message, a warning to anyone who thought about defying him.
Very chilling message. But his story wasn't all about conquest and destruction. There are some accounts that focus on his leadership qualities beyond the brutality.
That's important to remember. We tend to fixate on the violence, but to command the loyalty of so many different warriors, Attila must have had something else. Some kind of charisma, a sense of justice, maybe? Even within that brutal world, think about it. It wasn't just the Huns he was leading. His empire included all sorts of Germanic tribes, each with their own culture, their own ambitions.
So how did he keep them all together?
To hold their allegiance, he couldn't just be a fearsome conqueror. He had to be a leader they respected, maybe even admired. Some sources say he was known for being generous to his allies, fair in terms of justice, following their laws and customs. And they say he was a man of his word. He honored his agreements, his treaties.
That would be important to maintain those alliances.
Essential, yeah. So we have this contrast. On one hand, the ruthless conqueror. On the other, the seemingly just and respected leader.
It's a reminder that even these infamous figures from history, they're not always so simple. They're not just, good or evil. They're complex.
Exactly. And we have to consider the stories we tell, the narratives, the way we choose to remember them. Attila has been demonized, but also romanticized. Some see him as this bloodthirsty barbarian, others as a noble king. The truth is probably somewhere in between.
Right. It's like, is there any truth to those stories that paint him as a wise, noble leader? Or are they just trying to make him look better after all this time?
It's hard to say for sure. Separating fact from fiction, especially with figures like Attila, he was a man of his time, influenced by the values of his culture. And remember, nobility back then in 5th century Europe, it wasn't the same as today. What they saw as noble, we might see as barbaric.
Right, we can't judge them by today's standards.
Exactly. We have to understand them within their own context. It's not about condoning their actions. It's about trying to grasp the complexities.
So how should we view Attila? If we had to sum up his legacy, what are the key takeaways?
I think we have to acknowledge his military success. He was a remarkable leader in that sense. For a time, he completely reshaped Europe. And his conquests, they had a huge impact. They played a role in the fall of the Western Roman Empire and led to new power structures emerging.
And the terror, we can't forget about that.
Absolutely. Scourge of God. That wasn't just a nickname. It reflected a very real and terrifying part of his reign. But we also have to remember the complexities, the strategic brilliance, the loyalty he inspired, and the different ways he's been portrayed in different cultures.
And the mystery. The lost tomb, the questions about his language, where he came from, all that makes him even more fascinating.
It's like his story is still being written, with each new generation offering their own perspective.
That's what makes history so cool, right? It's not just a fixed story, it's an ongoing conversation.
Exactly. And as we find new evidence, as we look at the past in new ways, the conversation keeps evolving.
Speaking of new perspectives, is there anything about Attila or the Huns that you think deserves more attention? Any unanswered questions that you find particularly intriguing?
I'm really fascinated by the role of women in Hunnic society. We know so little about their lives, what their social standing was like, how much influence they had. The story with Honoria and the marriage proposal, it hints at maybe some female agency, but we need more evidence to really understand what was going on.
Yeah, that's a good point. We tend to focus on the men, especially when we're talking about war and empires. But women, they were essential in all societies, even those dominated by warriors. Their stories matter too.
I agree. And of course, finding Attila's tomb, that's still the ultimate goal for a lot of archaeologists. Think about the information we could get from that. The artifacts, the burial rituals, even the possibility of DNA analysis. It would be incredible. A whole new understanding, not just of Attila, but of the entire Hunnic culture.
It's crazy to think that such a powerful figure could just disappear like that, leave behind so many unanswered questions.
It shows you the power of time, the limits of what we know about the past. We can put together some of the pieces, but there will always be gaps, mysteries that we might never solve. But that's part of what makes history so interesting, the constant search for answers.
Like a never-ending detective story.
Exactly. Clues scattered across centuries, continents, and every new discovery gets us closer to understanding the people who came before us, the events that shaped our world, even if we never fully solve the puzzle.
It's amazing, right? We've learned so much about Attila, but there are still so many mysteries. There's one thing I'm curious about. We haven't really talked about what Attila actually looked like.
Ah, his appearance. That is interesting because for someone so famous, we don't have any firsthand descriptions. The best we have comes from Priscus, the Byzantine historian. He was part of an embassy sent to Attila's court.
So what did Priscus say? Was Attila this, like, towering, intimidating figure?
Actually, no. Priscus describes him as short, with a broad chest, a large head, flat nose, dark skin, a thin graying beard. And apparently he had a kind of haughty way of walking. His eyes were always moving, darting around, taking everything in. Not exactly the image we might have. Right?
Not at all. So much for the barbarian warlord stereotype.
It goes to show appearances can be deceiving. Attila's power, his influence, it wasn't about his size. It was his mind, his charisma, his ability to, well, to inspire fear, but also loyalty.
And speaking of inspiring fear, we can't wrap up without talking about the Huns' military tactics. They were unstoppable for years. What was their secret?
Their success came from a few things, but mainly they were just incredible on horseback, amazing riders. Their archery skills were legendary. They could ride for days, covering huge distances. Surprise attacks, hit-and-run tactics, they were masters of it.
So it was all about speed and agility.
Yeah, exactly. Like a whirlwind. They'd be here, then there, constantly moving. It was almost impossible for their enemies to keep up. Plus, they were experts at these feigned retreats. Lure their opponents in, make them think they were winning, and then bam! Turn around and attack with overwhelming force.
And they had some pretty advanced weapons too, right?
Definitely. Their bows were incredibly powerful. Their arrows could travel much farther with more accuracy. And they used all sorts of other weapons, lances, swords, even lassos. And they used them well.
Sounds like they were a force to be reckoned with. No wonder everyone was so afraid of them.
Oh, they were. But it wasn't just about brute force. Attila was a strategic genius. We talked about that. He understood that psychological warfare was just as important. Propaganda, intimidation, sowing fear and chaos among your enemies.
So it was about winning the mental game too.
Exactly. A terrified enemy is a vulnerable enemy. Attila used his reputation to his advantage. Sometimes he could get what he wanted without even fighting. The threat alone was enough.
Wow, so the power of reputation. So any last thoughts on Attila, this man who, still fascinates us after all these centuries?
I think he's a reminder, that humans are complicated. He was driven by ambition, by a thirst for conquest. He was a force of nature. He changed the world. And his story, all the mysteries, the unanswered questions, it's still captivating us centuries later.
Attila the Hun. Warrior, conqueror, leader, enigma. His story is still being told, and I think that's what makes history so interesting. Always something more to discover. So thanks for joining us on this journey. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.